Good morning. Welcome to class together. I hope that you've had a good week and you're prepared to look at some interesting things out of the Gospel of Luke today. I want to start off with a simple question. The questions that we don't really want to have to ponder very often, but we have to. The question is, who do you find difficult to associate with? Now, there are some people in this world that when you see them, you have this instant reaction to them. What about beggars on the street corner? How do you see them? People that you know who are a different political party than you assuage to be, or people who have a different culture or heritage, who dress differently, who talk differently, who are not like you. How do you deal with those people? How do you see them? That's the question we want to ask in today's lesson. For in societies in general, but in the society that Jesus lived in, that Luke wrote from, it was especially true that people were not all the same and viewed the same. But how does God view them? How did Jesus view them? And how should we, at the end of the day, do the same thing? So let's talk for this moment about what it was like in that day and time. There's in the Jewish world and the Roman world, there was always different kinds of people. In the Roman world, there were things such as what Paul had described. There's slave and free, male and female, Jew and Gentile. That was true around the whole world. And you had these different people of different places in their lives, different stations of their lives, different socioeconomic backgrounds in their lives. And so you come to this, and the Jews, though, they had narrowed it down to two things, Jew and Gentile. And what a Gentile was is if you were not a Jew, you were a Gentile. It was very simple to them. And you had nothing to do with the Gentiles, as we see in Acts chapter 10 when Peter is told to go to Cornelius and he protests that I've never ever eaten with the Gentile. And that was kind of the nature of things. But there were four different categories that we want to look at today, the different kinds of people that presented different kinds of challenges for the regular person on the street, if you will. The first is the leper. Leprosy is a terrible disease. It begins as a small white spot, begins to spread. It was an infectious disease in the times of Jesus. They had no treatments for it. It either went away by itself or claimed the victim. And over time, it would disfigure people. Noses would collapse. Joints would stiffen and finally fingers fall off, leaving nothing but a nub. It's a terribly dreaded disease. But what made it even worse was the treatment of it. When you come to the law of Moses, in Leviticus chapter 13, there is a long chapter that describes what do you do about diagnosing and treating spots such as these, whether they're mold spots or something else. How do you handle that? And you come down to verse 46 in Leviticus chapter 13. It says, the leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes, let his hair hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. There was this physical manifestation that they were commanded to follow. There was the verbal command to be given. All of those things created a problem. It created an anticipation, an idea of what the person was really like. They looked disheveled. They looked like beggars. They would be dirty and they would be scroungy and they would go around saying, unclean, unclean. And while I know that's the disease, What the Jews thought was it wasn't just the disease. They were unclean physically. They were unclean socially because they could not associate with people. They never saw families. They never went to towns. They banded together and traveled together as groups of lepers, and no one would touch them. But the other thing it meant was they were unclean to God. They were not allowed in the temple. They were not allowed to sacrifice. They were not allowed to go through the regular religious life of a Jew. They now were banished from God's purview. And for Jews, the leper was unclean in a very real way. Not just physically, but spiritually, not worthy of a touch. There's a second category that we would not consider this except in the ancient world if we didn't see it played out on our streets. Today, if you will look at women, and there are women of Middle Eastern descent, of different religious backgrounds, when they walk the streets of a modern city like Dallas, they'll be covered head to toe, many of them with nothing more than a slit to where they can see out of their veils. That was a reflection, that's a reflection today of what was like in the time of Jesus. Women were not considered worthy. In the synagogue, they were seated in a segregated section. The law, the oral law, the Torah, said that let no one talk with a woman in the street, no, not with his own wife. They were essentially shunned and considered not worthy of speech, of listening, or of hearing from. That was the way they were treated. They could be divorced on a whim. Things were different for women than they are today. And for them, they were put on the margins of society as well. The third category was the Samaritan. In 721 BC, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, conquered the Fertile Crescent. When he swept down over the nation of Palestine, one of the things he had already learned is, if you're going to conquer a people, you had better put down any further rebellion. And he had a wonderful plan to do that. His plan was that you would take some of the people out of the land as exiles, but then you would replace them with Assyrians, usually younger, who would intermarry with women and men in the society and therefore create a different breed of people. It was the first eugenics, if you will. And if you could breed them differently, they had now an allegiance to you, not to their own, to the country they'd lived in. It was an interesting thing, and that created a race called the Samaritans. And the problem with Samaritans is, for the Jew, even though they were half Jewish, they were never going to be full Jewish. They were always going to be half-breeds with all the degradation that term brings. So one of the things that happens is, in order to own property, they had to prove their breeding. When you go to Nehemiah chapter 7, for instance, when the people have come back from exile, the land has to be parceled back out, and they would get their ancestral homes as given to them by Joshua years and years before. But the only way to prove that their family really did own the property given to them by Joshua is they had to produce their bloodline. And so it says in Nehemiah chapter 7 that the people had to be enrolled by genealogy. Now, if you presented a bloodline that only went back so far, and suddenly at 721 it was pure beyond there, but you're not since then, you wouldn't get the property. You would now be considered an outsider. And so these people tended to clump together and live around what used to be the capital of the northern 10 tribes of Israel, called Samaria. And that's hence their name, Samaritans. And today there are some left, maybe not very many. About 10 years ago, I remember reading an article that there were 300 honest to goodness, card-carrying, provable Samaritans left. I don't know what that number is now. If it may be 0 for all I know. But at that time, those 300, they lived in the town of Nablus in central Palestine, a hotbed for Israeli and Palestinian uprisings that took place in that area. But they were always segregated from society, always hated, always despised for being half-breeds and never pure before God. Always part Assyrian, not part Jew. So there they were ostracized as well. And the last class is the tax collector. In a generation before Jesus was alive, the Romans instituted a plan to collect taxes in conquered territories. They would find those who would like to make extra money, usually farmers whose crops were failing or who didn't have the property to maintain them, and they would enlist them as something called tax gatherers. They were the responsible party. They were public servants, hence the name publican. And they were told to collect taxes on behalf of the Roman government. They were given authority to do that. The Roman government had high taxes. When they would conquer a people, they would take almost half of your income every year. So if you were already poor, you were doubly poor by that time. But the instruction of the tax collector was very simple. We expect our cut, but we don't regulate you. And the way you get paid is to collect taxes beyond our cut. It was rife for corruption. You could basically steal somebody's livelihood if you were a tax collector, and many did. It was a very lucrative position. Most of them became wealthy, at least many of them became wealthy. But they are also very despised and very hated, to the point that if you saw a tax collector, a fellow Jew, who you considered a turncoat and traitor, that they represented the Romans and not the Jews, if you saw one of them walking down the street, you would cross the street to keep from coming face to face with them. There was that much animosity. People never liked tax collectors, but this is different. This is a whole class of hatred for people just because of what they do. And some of it is well deserved. But the Jews, even though you had these 4 different kinds of people, they only put them in 2 classes. There was the righteous and the unrighteous. You kind of see this when you read one of the parables in Luke chapter 18, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee knows who the tax collector is because he has these categories in his mind of who's righteous and who's not righteous. It says, the Pharisee stood up, saying to himself, praying to thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men. Here are the other men. Here are the unrighteous. They are extortioners. They are unjust, meaning they don't keep the law of Moses. They are adulterers, and they are tax collectors. When you lump a tax collector in with the ungodly, the adulterer, and the criminal, you can pretty much see how people think of them. And so this was the group of people that when you read the Gospel of Luke show up over and over again, more so than you see in any of the other Gospels. It's not that they're missing from some of the other Gospels, but they are not the emphasis of them. There is not a highlight that seems to be placed upon them. And so Luke has a particular focus on those considered unrighteous and, by corollary, unworthy of the attention of God and the acceptance of Christ. The Messiah, if he was the Messiah, would never associate with people like that. And yet, as we all know, Jesus broke the mold. So let's take a little bit looking at a few of these instances. There's more than this, but these are the few we can do in a short period of time. One comes out of Luke chapter 5, verses 12 through 16. This is about a man who has leprosy. And he comes up, and I want you to notice some things about the man who has leprosy. He comes and he asks Jesus, he falls on his, he comes near to Jesus, something you're not supposed to do anyway. He saw him, he falls on his face, and he begins to beg him, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And it says that Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. He said, don't tell anybody, but you go tell the priest and show him for the proof that is commanded. And he went out and he told everybody his story, which is normal. And the word spread. Now, what did Jesus do that would have been so out of the ordinary here? Number one, he let the man approach him. But two, he did the one thing that no one ever did. He touched him. Think about what it would be like in your life if nobody ever touched you. A grandchild never hugged you. A friend never patted you on the back. How would that feel? Jesus touched him. He could have healed him any other way, but there was something he did to show approval and acceptance of this man. The touch was there. Let's go on to another one. Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50. Long passage. And if we read it together, you realize how long it is. One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair, the hair of her head, and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Now the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, and he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he said, say it, teacher. A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50, and when they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now which of them loved him more? And Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, you've judged rightly. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house, and you gave me no water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. She did not anoint my head with oil, but she anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. And those that were at the table began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. I want you to think about that little passage. What was Simon's estimation of this woman? Why do you think he called her a sinner? Was it an assumption he made? Maybe he had seen her on some street corners. Maybe as somebody who just comes in uninvited is uncouth. We're not sure exactly how he decided that, whether it was prior experience or just plain blind prejudice. But he considered the woman a sinner. But when Jesus heard him say this to himself, Jesus could read his mind. He said, I want to tell you a story. And Simon has to answer for himself. And he says, if this woman's been forgiven much, she'll love much. See, while Simon's judging her on one side and condemning her, Jesus is caring for her and forgiving her. It's something that a Jew would not do. People like that, this is how they would say, people like that do not deserve the grace of God. And yet Jesus gave it freely. But let's go on one more. Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, very familiar passage, a passage we call the parable of the Good Samaritan. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You've answered correctly, do this and you'll live. But desiring to justify himself, he asked Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him for dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place, saw him and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him, bound up his wounds, pouring oil on him, oil and wine. Then he sat him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii, gave it to the innkeeper, and said, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. And then Jesus goes on, Which of these do you think proved to be neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, The one who showed mercy. And Jesus said to them, Go and do likewise. You know, lawyer, doesn't he ask a great question? What do I have to be to have life? But then he seeks to justify him. Who is my neighbor? And he's probably expecting Jesus to say, Well, you've been doing pretty well in that if you've been caring for the people you like. But instead he tells him the story. But the question is not who needs the help. That would be the man who was robbed. But he says, who proved to be the neighbor to that man? In other words, if you're supposed to love your neighbor, who are you supposed to be loving in this story? Now, I find it interesting the lawyer just could not come to say the Samaritan. Instead, he said, well, the one who showed mercy. Jesus was telling him, can you care for the people you hate the most? That would be loving your neighbor. Or if the Samaritan is the neighbor in the story, and you love the neighbor, you're loving the Samaritan. Oh, that must have been a bitter pill to take. Let's go on to another. Luke chapter 21, first 4 verses. Jesus is in the temple, and it says, Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting in their gifts into the offering box. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 copper coins. And he said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they have contributed out of their abundance, but she gave out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on. That's interesting. How can Jesus spot this in a busy, crowded temple? How does he know the coins are copper? It's interesting that apparently the pot that they put them in was made of a particular metal, and when silver hit it, it made a certain ring. When copper hit it, it made a dull thud. He was listening. He was paying attention. And he says it's not the amount of money that you give, but the amount of your living that you give. For the passage could be translated, she gave of her life. I think that's a good one, frankly. Here's this poor widow, marginalized, not cared for, has nothing, poverty line, starving to death, and she's giving things to God. And then finally, one more, one that we know quite well. Luke chapter 19, first 10 verses. He entered Jericho and was passing through, and behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and he saw him and said, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all grumbled. He has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, half of goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he is also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. This is one of those interesting stories. Why do you suppose Zacchaeus came out there? What was he looking for from Jesus? He goes to a lot of trouble to see him. He's small. He knows he won't be accepted, but he comes out anyway. He takes great pains to do it. It's a lot of stress, a lot of problems. He climbs up in that tree so he can see him. Then Jesus invites him home. And the people are irritated. Why? Because Jesus seemed to care for this sinner rather than them. They're the righteous, he's the sinner. You eat with the righteous, not with the sinners. It looks like they would have been happy that maybe the Zacchaeus would change and that the money wouldn't be taken away from them any longer, but they seem to be disdainful that he would associate with anybody like a Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus indeed did change. And when you read this passage, you realize why he saw a Zacchaeus who has a name, not just the tax collector of town. It's because his lost radar is up. He sees lost people. He knows who needs what he has to give. There was something inside of Zacchaeus that needed something more than the money that he had accumulated. He needed to be right with God. He needed to be right with people. He needed something, and he couldn't find it any other way. But the big question that these things ask, and the question I think that Luke is really asking as he puts these in there, as he includes them, and by the way, everything we've looked at today is unique to Luke, just as the stories we looked at last week. These are unique to Luke. Why does Luke choose to include these when others didn't? Because Luke is asking a different question. He's asking the question, who does God accept? Now the Jews would have a great answer to that. He accepts those who have the bloodline of Abraham, who are faithful to the law, who are the righteous. Now to Greeks listening to the gospel of Christ, as Paul would preach it later, they had to be asking the same question. Would this God care for even me if he is the God of the chosen race of Israel? If they are the chosen people and I am not, how can God accept me? But it was a question being asked by the first century church at the same time. Last week we looked at this, but I wanted to bring it back again today for a simple reason, because it illustrates what the driving point that Luke has with these stories. In Acts chapter 15, Paul has come off of his first missionary journey and he has crossed the Gentile threshold. He has gone to the Gentiles. He is proclaiming to them that they can be saved through the blood of Christ by being baptized into Christ, and that's all that they need to do. The Jews were livid. So when he comes back to make his report, the men at Antioch say, we probably need to get this thing straightened out with the boys down in Jerusalem. So they go down to Jerusalem and they have this conference. They get together to talk about the differences of what they see. And you see what the prevailing view of the early church was as Paul was trying to win Gentiles to Christ. Some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees rose up and said, it is necessary to circumcise them in order and to order them to keep the law of Moses. Who does God accept? Those who've been circumcised and those who keep the law. Paul's not telling people that. He's saying, do you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God? You'll be immersed in the water for the forgiveness of your sins, and he'll wash them away, and you're part of his body. He accepts you just because of that. Is it through the blood of Christ, or is it through the rituals of circumcision? It's a big idea. And when Luke writes his gospel, it's against that backdrop that he writes it. Who does God accept? How does Luke answer the question? If you look through there, what we've looked at this morning, there's several answers to that. Number one, God accepts the one looking for cleansing. If you're not looking for cleansing, you have no reason to find it. One of the real problems with the Jews is they really weren't looking for cleansing. They thought they were okay with God. And yet, just like the leper who's looking to be physically cleansed, he's also looking to be socially cleansed and religiously cleansed. There are people in our world today that are looking for the cleansing. They want to be part of something, not because they've earned it, but because they're loved and cared for. They want to know that God cares for them in spite of what they've done and who they are at that moment. They'll do anything if they know they can find that kind of cleansing. Can you find them? But secondly, what Luke says is God accepts the one whose life shows what he professes to be. When he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, you have this lawyer who says, I love my neighbor as myself. So Jesus challenges that. Do you? That's what you say you do. Do you? Would you love a Samaritan? Because they're your neighbor too. You see, it gets really hard for us. We like to stay in our own little cubbyhole where it's nice, safe, and secure. And we don't want to have to love the folks that are a little bit, I don't know, they're dirtier than we are. They're not the same. They don't know as much. They're coarse. And yet, God accepts the coarse, but he also accepts those who can see past their own prejudices at the same time. Luke also says that God accepts the repentant, looking to be saved. Zacchaeus is an excellent subject for us because it tells us something. That there are people in our world, just as Zacchaeus was, who had everything they wanted, but not the one thing they needed. They're looking and they're willing to change whatever it needs to be changed in order to find the answer to their life. Because whatever they've got, they don't have it now. And God says, if you're willing to come to me, if you're going to bring a broken heart and a broken spirit, and you want to obey what I tell you to do, I don't care what you've done in your past, and I don't care where you are in your present. I want to change you for the future. There are those who are looking to be saved. Are we seeking and saving the lost? And finally, Luke answers the question, who does God accept, by saying the one who's already experienced a forgiveness. The woman at Simon's house experiences forgiveness. If you've experienced the forgiveness that only God can give, He accepts you. He doesn't need smug self-righteousness. He wants sinners who've been repented. Perhaps we've been too quick to talk about them and us. The truth is, them are us, and us are them. We're all sinners in need of the grace of God. And if God has forgiven us, and God can forgive them, then we have to accept what God accepts. For we're nothing more. So as we come to the end of this lesson, what can we pull together? What do we kind of learn from this? What do we need to be challenged by? It really is challenging if you read through all of this, and you can take more time than we've had this morning. It's interesting what happens. One question: do you see others as Jesus does? Simon saw a sinner. The people of Jericho saw a tax collector. A lawyer saw a Samaritan. The rich saw a poor woman who didn't have any reason to be there. But Jesus saw a soul to be saved, someone to be forgiven, someone to be cleansed. When you look at people, do you only see two categories? Lost and saved. If you see lost and saved, you'll know what to do. If you see them as outsiders and insiders, it's a different question. Jesus saw people and helped people, not because of where they came from or how much money they had or what their professions were, but because they needed to be saved. But the second question, do we dare not accept who God accepts? Do we ever say, well, I don't know. I think maybe if they want to be a Christian, they can do so way over there. If God accepts you, we are bound to accept the people God accepts otherwise. There are some people unlovely. There are some who come to the church, baptized into Christ, who are coarse. They don't think the way we would like for them to think. They don't have the good backgrounds we would like for them to have. They don't have the clothes to wear that we wear. They may not smell very good. But do you dare not accept who God accepts? It's a challenge for us. Thank you for joining me today. Next week, we're going to finish our part of Luke by looking at how Luke sees the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, because he sees it a little differently than Matthew and Mark. And I think those differences are important to see. So next week, we'll be with you for that. I hope you've had a good lesson today, and you'll have a good rest of your day. And I'll see you again next week.